This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do all for the love of learning.
Hello, I'm Lainey Liberty, and this is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. And this is episode number 2. Sir Ken Robinson wrote, quote, "The fact is that given the challenges we face, education doesn't need to be reformed. It needs to be transformed. The key to this transformation is not to standardize education, but to personalize it, to build achievement on discovering the individual's talents of each child, and to put the student in an environment where they learn and where they can naturally discover their true passions." Ken Robinson wrote that in The Element, How Finding Your Passions Changes Everything. In tonight's episode, we'll explore some of the transformations being made to the education system from the inside out. We have an incredible panel, each with different perspective and each with a unique approach, but all with one thing in common: the desire to transform the education system from the inside out. Tonight we'll speak with Anna Briggs Thompson, a teacher who has adopted a philosophy of self-directed learning from within the education system and shares much of her discoveries on her blog, teachersjourneytolife.com. Anna calls herself a guerrilla teacher by day and a social media activist by night. She documents her journey daily on a variety of social media sites and contributes to a meaningful and transformative discussion about education. So welcome, Anna.
Hi, Lainey. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone.
We're so happy you're here. And tonight also we'll speak with Steve Hargadon, a longtime education advocate who, among many achievements, has pioneered the use of social networking in education and supported and encouraged the development of thousands of other education networks. He is the founder of the Learning Revolution Project, the host of Future of Education interview series, and is currently producing an event in Asheville, North Carolina called Reinventing Education, a What If 360. Steve, we're so happy to have you here tonight.
Thanks, Lainey. Really delighted to be here with Anna and Andrew.
Fantastic. And finally, meet Andrew, a father of 2 grown unschooled children who are both currently attending university. Andrew is a well-known and passionate voice for change within the education social media landscape, an advocate for attachment parenting, self-directed learning, and a practitioner of herbal medicine. Andrew, I'm so honored to have you here tonight as well.
Hi, thanks, Lainey. Lovely to be here. Really proud.
This is an incredible panel, so I'm really, really looking forward to jumping into the topic tonight. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each panel member to share a little bit more about their background, and if you can also share your thoughts on why the education system needs to be changed. So Anna, let's start with you.
Yeah, so my name is Anna. I am a Danish citizen, but I'm living in Sweden currently. I've been living here for about 4 years. And I actually grew up myself in the alternative education system. I attended a Freinet school as a child. I don't know if either of you know the Freinet pedagogy, but it's a rather free, I would say that it's one of the pedagogies that's the most similar to the unschooling principles. It holds a lot of value in respecting the child and respecting the child's work. And one of the things that we had growing up is that we had to do our own schedule for the week, for example. So we got to decide what we wanted to learn. And I think that really set the background for me in a way, because I don't have the traditional public school experience. I have seen that it can be different. And then growing up, I started developing a passion for education naturally, and just being naturally interested in it, both the pedagogical side of it as well as the sociological side of it. So as an adult, I ended up first taking a bachelor degree in social work, and as a kindergarten teacher, working with that for some years. And then later on, when I started really thinking about wanting to revolutionize the education system and wanting to get into the heart of it, I decided to embark on a master in educational sociology. And both of those educations really disillusioned me. Like, I did not learn that which I thought I was going to learn. It was, to a certain degree, I would almost go as far as saying that it's a little bit useless. I've actually learned more about education from practicing, from being a teacher, than I have from sitting in class for many years, which is indicative of the education system in general, that we actually learn more from life. We learn more when our learning is self-directed. And so over the past few years, I've been looking at how can I implement what I see in praxis while still being in an education system. I work as a teacher right now, as a native language teacher. So I teach Danish children in Sweden, and I teach children from about the ages of 1 till 16. So I have the entire spectrum. I go to private schools, public schools, small schools, big schools. Like, I see everything. And in that process, my reflection on what's going on has just kicked into gear. Like, I can't stop it. So I decided to write it out in a blog and really get my thoughts and my ideas out into paper, and as well as sharing it with the world. Because I know that especially a lot of parents, they're completely disconnected from the education system and from what's going on in their child's lives. And here in Sweden, there's a high level of trust in the education system. Like, it's the education system responsibility to educate my child. But we know, for example, here from Sweden, the recent, those OECD, PISA, they do these big tests of all school children in the industrial countries, you could say. And Sweden, that used to be one of the quote unquote best educational systems, has actually gone down over the last 10 years. And the government, they can't understand why. We're supposed to be among the best. And then instead of, looking at, like you were saying with Ken Robinson, how can we transform the system? They just do reform upon reform upon reform. They do more testing, less creativity, less personalization. And what I see, because I teach students of all ages, is I see what happens from when a child at the ages of 5 or 6 comes into the education system, and they're full of life and they're full of lust for learning. They're so happy and so grateful of being there, and it's a joy to be with them, and to, they're interested in everything. And then you see, as they grow older, I'll talk more about this later, as they grow older, the spark of life just kind of disappears from their eyes. And I would say that this is really heartbreaking and tragic, and also because it doesn't have to be this way. And I'm sure that Steve and Andrew can talk more about that. It doesn't have to be like that. Education doesn't have to be like that. So that's my passion, and my reason to be here is that I see that it can be different, and I see it doesn't have to be this way. And I see that we tend to take the current education system for granted, as though, that's the best we could come up with, when I'm 100% sure that it's not. We can do so much better, and we can implement so many more principles that aren't currently being lived in the current education system.
I'm a reader of your blog, and you actually outline some of the experiences that you do have in the classroom. And for me, it's very compelling reading, because you answer the question, what needs to be changed in your writing through expressing your experiences. So I'm really, really happy that you're here on the show from the inside, from within the system, and sharing those experiences. I think it's really important, especially to those of us that chose to step outside of the system. You know, we're all here for the same reason, and that reason is we care about learning, we care about education. And yes, granted, there's a million different ways you can apply it, but I'm really, really happy that you're sharing that experience. One question before we move on. I'm not familiar with the school system in Scandinavia. Is school compulsory, or is homeschooling legal in these countries?
Yeah, and that's also the thing, is that I live in Sweden, where homeschooling is actually fully, completely illegal. It's one of the only countries in the world, along with Germany, where homeschooling, and it's not just a little bit illegal. It actually, the law got even more restricted in 2010. So it's not like it's going to brighten any day soon. There are some court cases also going all the way to the European level, because it's going against human rights. It's going against the European Convention. So in Denmark, where I'm from, homeschooling is legal. So yeah, schooling is compulsive. And that's also one of the reasons why, from my perspective, we also we really need voices from within the education system that can show what it's really like. Because there's so much propaganda about the education system being good and being okay, and it's not really. So I really like the quote that you had from Ken Robinson, where he says that it's a transformation that's required, not just a reform.
Thank you, Anna, and I can't wait to hear from you later on. There's so many questions I have for you. But let's move on first to Steve. And Steve, would you share with us a little bit of your background, and also share with us some of your thoughts on why you think the education system, as it currently is, needs to be changed?
Yeah, that was lovely, Anna. I feel like there's so much that I have in common with Anna and Andrew. I can't wait to keep exploring. So my wife and I are the parents of 4 children, 3 of whom homeschooled, unschooled, or did other things. And we've always sort of called ourselves independent schoolers, meaning we made choices for our children that we thought, with and for our children, that we thought were best at the time. Our 4th child has seen all of that and is determined to do a traditional education. And she, because I'm a big believer in agency, right? And I have to support her entirely in what she's doing. So I read the books with her and the like, and that's part of my quick story. So I started Classroom 2.0 about 8 years ago, and did a number of events and activities around kind of peer-to-peer social technologies for teachers. So it started with this sort of massive modern social network technology, and then it came to holding large online conferences where we sort of broke the rules. Everybody who submitted to present could present. We figured, you have no room space, time issues. So the idea here is for participation. And that moved me into a very interesting sort of realm with education, which it put me in the progressive category. And it also led me to be in conversation with a lot of people who were thinking sort of very deeply about changing education. And I actually find myself disagreeing with Ken. And if I put myself if I look at Anna's circumstance, and she said she got disillusioned, I went from getting disillusioned to kind of getting mad. And I'll tell you how that happened. So we took a trip around the world the year before last, and we finished in France at the museum in Caen, which is associated with Normandy and World War II. And there was a section there on propaganda. And it really kind of struck me such that I was very interested in the ways in which propaganda was used, especially by the Americans and the Allies, in ways that didn't feel sort of right to me in terms of manipulating the population. So I went back and read the history of that era and discovered that, in the late 1800s, we shifted from philosophy to psychology, and this belief that we could test and manipulate the mind in the same way we did other natural scientific phenomena. And there was really a significant shift at that point in time toward thinking about controlling other people. So you went from this belief in kind of individual agents where you respected that autonomy and individuality to this, the word progressive actually came from this idea we had progressed past the constitutional idea of checks and balances and individual rights to a place where we knew enough to make decisions and then to use propaganda or symbols and emotions to get the bulk of the population to go along. So for me, there's this very interesting moment at which I kind of realized, and I took a break from my interview series. This was such a serious set of thoughts for me that I had to kind of ponder them personally. And I came to the conclusion that our education system is largely about compliance and control and not actually about unleashing learning capacity. And that whether by design or not, and I think some of it was by design and some was by good intention, the end result is that most school students experience when they leave school the belief that they're not good learners rather than that they are good learners. And this is sort of profound to me, that we have a system which claims to be for the benefit of learning, but actually ends up with the result of most people feeling they're not capable, which serves some interests very well, right? It's a populace that doesn't question certain kinds of things, and it doesn't push back on certain kinds of policies. And so I'm now in the camp, let's put it that way, of seeing enforced schooling much like an issue as large as the civil rights issue in the United States or the Indian independence issue. I don't mean in any way to diminish the significance of either of those movements, only to raise the level of our thinking about learning to that same level. We create an enforced system which is so destructive to so many who are powerless to kind of push back on it. I think if we're lucky historically, we'll look back at this time and say, how did we let that happen? How are we comfortable that rather than bringing out the latent capacity of every individual and believing in the importance of supporting them and their agency and then letting them make decisions, that we've created this enforced structure of decision making, which, and I'm not the first to say this, but I know it's always controversial, means their school experience is much more like being in prison than it is being a citizen in democracy. So now I've painted a stark picture there, right? But at least that gives some context to kind of where my thinking currently is.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you on so many different levels. I've actually looked into the background, the history of the educational system, and as it's been developed and expressed in different areas, mostly in the Western world. It's based on a set of control and a set of creating what's good for the society, what the society needs. So it's not really about the individual. I don't think the system was designed to support learning. That's just my opinion. We're going to actually get into these sorts of ideas a little bit later on, but there's a lot of documentation that supports this, and it's really disheartening. There's a lot of people that get out of the system, and it's interesting that you are still really 1 foot in, 1 foot out, supporting the system, serving the system in terms of all of your conferences and the technology that you support. But it's about a system that I feel has problems.
Yeah, so it's worth. Can I take 2 more seconds?
Yeah, please.
And I think it's worth sussing that out a little bit because I don't feel like it's as stark as we maybe portray it, right? I mean, the people I know who are teachers, they don't go to school believing that they're creating problems for their students. They do so with the desire to be helpful. They do it within the framework of having been told that this is the system that is helpful to students. And And I've gone on my own journey of thinking. And if I really believe in dialogue and the value of us coming together as individuals, especially with these new social technologies, and we'll talk about how this is sort of a recycling of history for me from the early 1900s to 1960s to now, that it's really important that we don't marginalize ourselves and get outside of the conversations. I mean, John Holt is this brilliant voice who sort of very quickly just became outside of the mainstream. And so I really believe in people, and teachers are people, and students are people, and try and create the best possible place for dialogue to take place without putting ourselves in a box or getting so defensive that we cease to actually be able to have that conversation. Now, we're among friends here. I could be very direct in what I said, but my goal would be to be part of a very human conversation and not putting up walls or barriers to understanding that people are, I love what Gandhi did, right? It wasn't me versus you. It was, how do we together figure out an issue, right? So this isn't me trying to create a dichotomy between those who believe what I just said and others who believe differently. It's how do we together look at this idea of learning, and how do we together solve it, sort of in an appreciative inquiry approach rather than sort of divided camps.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Steve. Let's move on right now to Andrew. And Andrew, if you could give us a little bit more information about your background, and also share with us some of your thoughts on why you feel the education system needs to be transformed or changed.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to say a couple of points about what Steve said there. Particularly in terms of something I've learned being on Twitter in the past 6 or 7 months. My ideas about a lot of issues were fairly fixed, and I've really learned that a much better way is to try to build bridges with people rather than automatically come against somebody in the battle. Building bridges will work a lot better because we're all trying to create a better world, as far as I'm concerned. And we're all doing it in our different ways. So building bridges seems to be the best way. Going back to another thing Steve said about the concept of the teacher having to be both educator and jailer. And I think that is a really big problem. It's a really big problem for me, and I think it's a really big problem for teachers having to occupy those two roles. If the child is at school, he has to be there. The teacher is the jailer, and he's trying to be an educator at the same time. Yeah, I'll talk about that a bit more later. Back to my background. I had a conventional education. I went to what's called in Britain a grammar school. Grammar school, it's called a grammar school because it was based on learning Latin grammar, incidentally. These were essentially private schools but the places were paid for by the state. So I had the benefit of what amounts to a private school education, but for free. All my teachers had degrees from Oxford or Cambridge. It was a very, very academically based school. I did very well academically, and I went to university and got a good degree. But I grew up with that idea that there were clever kids and thick kids. I was a clever kid and the other ones were thick kids. And I still have that in my mind. And I think that was a real drawback for me in life, seeing myself separated from these other people who had different skills from me. That was what my background was in. I got a degree in maths and computer science. I moved into computing. I worked in an investment bank in the City of London, designing computer systems for foreign exchange and bond dealers. That was my job. Until it got to the mid-80s, and I read a book by Doris Lessing called Shikasta. Doris Lessing was pretty much of an anarchist, it should be said. And she was saying that the agents for change are people, not governments, not corporations, but people. People will create those changes. And I read that and took that in. And then in the late 80s, I was going a lot of personal growth courses, retreats. And somebody, for some reason, I was not married, I didn't have children, I didn't have a girlfriend, decided to lend me 4 books. One of them was Continuum Concept by Jean Liedloff, attachment parenting book. One in particular was Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich. And this transformed my life. The other 2 were Birth Without Violence by Le Boyer and Michel Adornbel, I can't remember the name. Anyway, this transformed my view of the world, that this is one way, at least, in which we could change the world. If we can bring up our children differently, we can start to change the world. And that was what my driving force became. And then I was lucky enough to meet my wife at a Friends of the Earth conference. I decided to home educate before I met my future wife, and certainly before I had children. So I persuaded her that was the idea, that was the way we should go. We brought up our children with co-sleeping and carrying. And when it came to school, they didn't go to school. They did go to school very briefly. That was her idea, that they should experience school. It was the right idea, I think, actually. They got one, in England, we have something called GCSEs, which is the exams you take at 16. Our boys have got, they're twins. Our boys have got one GCSE in art. They're now at university in their second year. Aaron's doing film production, video, and Fingal's doing fine art. They've got to university. We're happy about that. If it had not been an art subject, it might have been a bit more difficult, I think. But so, yeah, my background is essentially in home education, deschooling / home education. And now education, home education and attachment parenting form a very large part of my work in trying to create change in the world, which is what I'm doing a lot on Twitter these days.
Yes, and in fact, we connected because you're such a vocal advocate for change in the education arena on social media, and we completely meshed. You know, we're constantly supporting what one another share on Twitter. So I think that's wonderful. But you mentioned something about your process. And can you just define, in case somebody's watching and doesn't know what the term deschooling means?
For me, deschooling, what Illich meant in terms of deschooling society was we should remove the whole concept of the school being a teacher and a learner, and make it such that people could learn from people who had something to teach them. That's what he meant by deschooling. For me, it simply meant extracting yourself from the schooling system, the traditional schooling system. I think in Britain, the term deschooling isn't used so much. We tend to use home education as the term for being outside that system. In England, of course, it's completely legal to home educate. You should have, your child has to receive a full-time education at school or otherwise, which is why our home education organisation in the UK is called Education Otherwise from the law. I think it comes about from the aristocracy having governesses. So the whole concept of being able to educate outside school is really enshrined in our society, I think, which is fortunate.
Okay. Yeah, wonderful. And actually, why don't we start off with you with the next question? And in your opinion, what do you think the purpose of education is?
Crikey.
In a nutshell.
I think it's a difficult question to say what the purpose of education is. The purpose of life for me is to learn things, and take and play the best part in life that you possibly could do. I think education is essentially, aside from that, education to me tends to rather mean a process of education rather than a process of learning, if you see what I mean. I see them as two separate things. Does that make sense?
Well, in that case, why don't you go ahead and define in your perspective what education is and what learning, how that differs from learning.
Okay. Learning for me is essentially a lifelong process. We learn all the time about everything. We learn how to, as I said on Twitter, we learn how to deal with people who might have different views to ourselves. We learn how to deal with our wife or our girlfriend or our children. Education for me is more to do with learning skills which might be useful in specific circumstances. Specific circumstances might be a university degree or a job. So learning is more of perhaps to me, a fluid process.
Interesting. And you opted out of the education system, but you home educated. So it in your experience, then education is something that you can have control over as well.
Yeah, I should say, I mean, I'm using the British term, home education. I mean, really, there wasn't much education going on. They learnt things. We didn't teach them. We didn't educate them. they received their education. And I think with a lot of homeschooling parents, that the fact is that you do a lot of talking. Maybe a lot of the kids feel they get talked at a lot, but we hope that we were talking with them a lot. And so they learnt a lot of things that school-educated kids don't learn, mainly because that concept with school-educated kids, the main adults they come across are adults who are in control of them, not their parents necessarily, the teachers. We noticed that with the boys' school-educated friends who came around. When we talked to them, they were clearly frightened. An adult was talking to them, and this was a frightening experience. And it was depressing to see that they saw all adults as potentially controlling, frightening figures who were in charge of them, rather than somebody who they could communicate with on an equal level.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. If I can ask this same question then to Steve. Steve, do you have some thoughts on the purpose of education?
Yeah, is it okay if I backtrack slightly there just to ask Andrew?
Please.
It's been helpful for me to think of schooling as the word that most describes the kind of force or control, because I can see some really positive uses of the word education and self-education and the idea of drawing something out of someone. And this is a dialogue I'm sort of thinking out loud in my own ways. But I think maybe the reason I've used the word schooling is because Illich sort of so brilliantly shows the way in which the model of schooling sort of translates into all of our sort of large cultural institutions. So for what it's worth, I've sort of shifted away from using education in that way to thinking of the word schooling as being a closer piece for me. Lainey, what was the question again?
The question is, in your opinion, what do you think the purpose of education is? And I think each person has a different relationship to the word education, the word learning, and also, as you pointed out, the word schooling. And there's not one right or wrong answer. And I think that the purpose of having the voices of the alternative education movement here, speaking and sharing their opinions, is to have all these different perspectives. But I think it is important for this particular dialogue to know where everybody's coming from.
So I really like the definition the transcendentalists used, right, which was that community was strongest when individuals were flowering to their full capability. And they believed that there was a sort of a divine nature to each person. And so the education was to help draw out the best individually, which then in combination produced the best community. And so for me, it really comes down to sort of this difference between the sort of the Socratic idea of helping somebody develop themselves. My job as a parent is not to tell my kids, but to look for moments to actually connect with them and say, well, that's interesting. Here's how I think about this. And let me kind of model for you my emotional or intellectual thought processes relating to something. But knowing that you're an individual, and like Martin Buber sort of beautifully described, I have to see you as sort of the divine you, the you that carries its own agency and its own individuality. So for me, I really feel like education is about helping an individual reach their highest capacity, believing that it's the combination of individuals who are thinking deeply who will then create solutions, which is very different than this idea that we create a solution and then we sort of mandate people to accomplish it. Right? So if you look at the current economic situation, when you can make the argument, and I do, that the loss of entrepreneurial activity, I think we have half as many small businesses in the United States as we did 6 years ago, that's tragic, because you need that kind of energy that comes from limited boundaries and lots of freedom for people to play and to figure things out and to create solutions. But what I think we're getting a lot of instead is this sort of idea that somebody smart is going to make decisions, and then we're going to school people to fill the jobs that we believe are the appropriate ones. And for me, that's really I wish I could remember the name of the book, but there was this great book where they looked at countries that were very similar geographically. Maybe somebody remembers. And one country ended up flourishing and another didn't. And it came down to the social institutions and the ways that they saw their culture. And so if you have this idea that I think, represents the thinking of freedom in Western societies, that you have limited boundaries and lots of freedom, then you get vibrant societies. But if you have lots of control and limited freedom, then you're not going to get the same kind of outcome. So for me, it really is about freedom in the individual.
Wonderful, thank you. And let's move on to Anna. Now you're deep within the system itself. What do you from within the system, the actual purpose? How are you experiencing the system as defining its own purpose?
Oh my God, I have so much to say, not just to this question, but also to what Steve and Andrew has been talking about. Well, yeah, so I mean, we can look at it from, you could say, the intrinsic or the existential purpose of education in a way, and then what the school system is promoting or saying that it is. One of the very new directions that the school system is giving itself all over the Western world is the mantra that we have to prepare ourselves for the knowledge economy and the global competition. And this is something that kids are even being told. They are aware of it. I have to grow up so that I can compete in the global knowledge economy, which is absolutely heartbreaking and absurd, especially when talking about education. Because one thing is, to look at it from a perspective of, well, that's the reality, like seeing the world at war economically with itself, and then wanting to prepare your kids for that. I mean, that's one thing. Like, showing them that life is all about survival and survival of the fittest and so forth, which is also quite stark. But then to say that their educational process has to be about that, like it's essentially just all about fear. And something that I think we tend to forget is that the global economy and the way that the current system is set up, it didn't create itself. It's not, and it's not a physical system that cannot be changed. It's created by human beings. It is one model. It is one system, and we tend to take it for granted as though, because that's what it is, it must mean that it is optimal. And that just goes to show the level of brainwashing that we've all been indoctrinated into, which is essentially the problem. Because the thing with education is we've all been through it. There's not a single person on this planet who hasn't been through some form of education, some process of education or schooling, as Dee was talking about. And so it is one of the things that we collectively share on the entire planet. And just to go all the way back to what you guys were talking about earlier about the purpose of the schooling system, if you'd read John Taylor Gatto, for example, who investigated the history of the education system extensively, it actually goes all the way back to a German system, a Prussian system, where the governments, the local governments, they created the public school idea because they needed to indoctrinate soldiers to be more moldable, to be more compliant. And that is then what has been adopted into the entire Western system. And from that perspective, you can say that Richard Grove says it really well, and he says that the system was never broken, it was built this way. It is meant to create broken people. And I know that that's a very controversial perspective, but having been in the education system for 15 years, I agree. And that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people in the education system that has good intentions. So, but the system itself, and we have to, like I said before, remember it didn't create itself. Okay, so that would be the school system's own definition. And in that, there are a lot of, they talk a lot about friendships and equal opportunities, but it's a little bit schizophrenic in the way, because what the kids are experiencing on a daily basis is not equal opportunity, for example. So they're being told a lot of fancy and wonderful things, and then the reality of it is completely different, and they're trapped inside of it. So if I then go to say what an intrinsic purpose of education would be, or what I would say, is that education happens all the time, in every moment. Like right now, we're maybe learning new words that we're not even aware of. We're learning new perspectives. We're learning about this technology that we're using to do this broadcast, so education happens in every moment. It's learning how to live life, learning how to be in life. And then, there's the individual level, and then there's the social level, where education is about what kind of society is it that we want? How can we coexist on this planet in a way that is in alignment with the ecosystems of the planet and of ourselves? Like what ways would be optimal for us as a race, but also interconnected, interspecies based, for this world to thrive. And then the individual level of that is how to educate a child to be that, and to be that guardian of the earth. And I agree with this, what you were saying, Steve, about the divine nature. I also see, not in a spiritual sense, but in almost like an existential sense, that each person has something unique to bring to the world. Each person has, and it doesn't have to be like airy-fairy, or it can be very concrete. Each person has an expression or a skill or something that they bring. And that's why I'm so excited about unschooling, because I see that unschooling is really a philosophy and a principle that allows that to unfold, allows that unique expression to flourish and come out. Whereas the current schooling system, it just suppresses it. I could say so much more, but I want to, of course, give you guys I have a notepad with so many points, but I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Great insights. And it's incredible to hear that you're talking about self-directed education within a system that really doesn't support self-directed education. Now, I'm coming to this whole conversation from the perspective of not working in education, but stepping completely outside of it. And I had to totally redefine what education meant to both me and the relationship to education with my son as well. And we changed the definition of the word education to no longer meaning something that was institutional, but it was a sum total of all of our experiences and the addition of information, this information on top of that information, and we kept building based on our experiences from traveling and self-directed learning, and so we're not coming at it from an educational institutional perspective. And so now we've got all these different voices defining what education is. And I think this is the most incredible conversation that we need to have. So, Anna, I want to actually move on and ask you, within the education system itself, what do each of us have the power to change?
Oh, that's a very, very good and very tricky question. A question that I'm asking myself every day, because like Andrew was saying, in a way, the word teacher is completely off balance with any like idea about self-directed learning and also with unschooling. And I understand that it to some may seem controversial or like oppositional that I can say that I'm applying unschooling principles within the education system. But I mean, I would say that it's definitely possible to do something from within in the system. And one of the perspectives that I have, also, like I was saying before with education, is that education and whatever form of schooling system there is, whether it's parents taking on that responsibility, which we can talk more about later, or whether there is some form of organized community learning. Education is the process where we can really change the world, because that is where we come into the world and learn how to live in the world. And we've all been through it, and we all know that, I'm sure that we also have to de-school ourselves from all the destructive behaviors and beliefs and ideas that has come with us, both from our upbringing, with the education we got from our parents, as well as the schooling system. So from my perspective, we have to take co-responsibility for the system that we've created. And now I mean the world that we as human beings have created upon this earth. So the political, the economic, and also the education systems. We can't simply, and I really understand why people do it, why they choose to opt out of the system. And I also understand that it's an important process to go through. But I would also say that it's something to change the systems and to change the world. We have to do it from within. We have to take responsibility from the system. You don't necessarily have to be a teacher, you know, it's not like everyone has to do it this way, but we have to assist the system to collapse. We have to assist it to let go, you know, and one of the ways we can do that from within. So I'm doing this on a daily basis, and I'm using myself as a tool. So because as a teacher, I am my own tool. So I am, when I walk into the classroom, I teach very small groups. I make sure that I am 100% there, that I don't bring anything with me into, like, I am there for that child or those children in that hour or however long we have, and I let go of everything else. I'm unconditionally placing myself there, and I'm constantly working on being an example, and like, for instance, when something is not working, I've had students that were they were giggly and having fun, and I'm not an authoritarian teacher in any way. You know, I pretty much let them explore, but they were so excited and hyper that we couldn't really do anything. And so I started getting a little bit frustrated, and so I went home and I investigated, you know, instead of going like, you know, I need to come down on them and I need to enforce, they have to learn. I looked at, well, what am I doing wrong? Like, what am I doing to, you know, create this situation? And is there actually anything wrong about the fact that they're having fun and giggling? And I had to swallow some camels and admit some things about myself, that I thought I should have control over the situation. I was afraid of what their parents would think. I was afraid of what other teachers would think, you know, that they could hear them have so much fun. I mean, how absurd is that? And so I walked through this process internally as well as externally, as well as sharing, you know, on my blog, so that others can do the same, however, wherever they are in their world or in the system, so that we can, you know, be together in this education system and learn and grow without having to reinforce the same indoctrination, you know, that you have to learn and you have to sit still. And, you know, I let the moment unfold and see what happens and let them take direction. And it's actually been a challenge, because it's so easy to take control over a child. It's much more challenging to trust them and to trust their natural learning ability and to see the opportunity in every moment.
Beautiful. And, you know, I mean, the question originally was, what can we do within the education system to change it? And you're a walking example of somebody who's awake and functioning within the system. Your writing is so incredibly inspirational. And I think you, by living your truth and functioning consciously within that system, you're bringing so much light and change and transformation. So thank you, Anna. I'm so thrilled you're here tonight sharing your story. I'm gonna move on, and I'm gonna ask Andrew what you think we can do to change the system what each of us have, what power each of us have to change the system from within.
Okay. Going back to the concept about I still have a problem with this word education, because I think in Britain calling it home education meant people will always ask, so what did you teach them? How did you teach them? The answer was always that we didn't really teach them. So I'm still feeling myself that education means teaching. I think I might be wrong listening to the rest of you, but that's still my feeling that, of course, homeschooling is even worse in that respect for me. We certainly weren't homeschooling, but so what was the question, Lainey?
Well, first of all, you're not wrong. We're all coming from different points of view and different relationships to the specific words that we're talking about, education, learning, and so forth. And really, for me asking those questions again was not to quiz anybody, but it was to get a sense of what our worldview is on education. So when you express your thoughts and ideas, we're familiar with your language and your meaning. So no, you're not wrong. The question was, what do you believe, what aspects we have the opportunity to change from within individually? So, you know, if somebody's listening to this interview, they can express those sorts of ideas from their own perspective.
I think everything. We have the opportunity to change everything from within. The most difficult thing I find for people is for people to think they actually can make any changes. And in everything, I find it a lot, again, talking about Twitter a lot, we're self-sufficient in vegetables here. And I talk a lot to gardeners, and gardeners are growing vegetables. And I said, you're changing the world. You're changing the world one carrot at a time, one lettuce at a time. And I get a blank look, a metaphorical or virtual blank look on Twitter, because I find it difficult to get the idea forward to people that by home educating or growing vegetables or keeping chickens or whatever, you are changing the world. And we really need to be putting forward this idea to people that those small changes that we make, where we say, I'm taking control of this for myself, I'm taking responsibility for this for myself, and it's those things that will change the world. It's people taking responsibility to make changes for themselves, which will spread out into the world.
I agree with you 100%. And I think too, there's a lot to be said about a family who raised their twin boys outside of the education system, and they've now chosen to go into the university system. So it shows that you did make a choice, you made a change, and developed a system that worked for yourself and your family, and it was successful in terms of cultural perspectives. So yeah. Good job.
It's also thinking about it, because it's interesting that what I was against was the teacher jailer concept of school. At the university, of course, it's a completely different concept. They don't have to be there. It's best if they are there, really, but they don't have to be there. So we were happy with that. And in fact, before that, they went to a sixth form college, which is I don't know what you call that in the States. They did one of them did an art, it's called a BTEC. One of them did an art course, and the other did a film production course. So they went into the system at that age. But by that time, such a college, again, is not really the teacher-jailer concept. The children are there because they want to learn that. And the teachers are there to help facilitate that. They did take an exam.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the school system. The school system, particularly in this country, where the kids have to wear uniforms. That way, uniformity, of course, is the exact opposite of the sort of thing we were trying to achieve. And in fact, I had an argument with headmaster. That's actually why the kids left there. And about the wearing of uniforms. And his reason for what the kids wearing uniforms was because when you worked in an office, you'd have to wear a suit. So children needed to learn to wear the tie and the jacket, because that's what they'd have to do for the rest of their lives. It didn't really cut much ice with me, that idea, obviously. So yeah, it didn't go very well at school. It involved me wasting a lot of time arguing with the headmaster. So yeah, I think somebody who talked to that, either Steve or Anna talked about that. the idea that schools, I think it was Anna, that schools see themselves as a method of teaching children how they can best succeed in whatever the economy is at the moment. And that's really quite depressing to me.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Thank you for your answer, and thank you for sharing that. I'd actually like to move on to Steve now, and if you can answer the same question, what aspects from within the educational system do each of us have the power to change, in your opinion?
Okay, so I'm going to admit to feeling some bit of a dilemma here, and maybe a little bit of cognitive dissonance. But also,
Please.
there's a piece here that bothers me, right? And I think it's the reason that revolutions have to take place.
Yes.
Because there's a narrative power. There's a power to current narratives, and I do really appreciate and love the ways in which individuals, by living their beliefs, can help affect larger cultural shifts, but I'm concerned that they never gain enough traction to actually change the larger narrative. So there were lots of people who treated blacks well in the United States, and they made a difference for the revolution, but you still needed the revolution for me. And so this is a dilemma for me, because I think we have this phrase, truth to power, right? This idea that there's this moment of courage to actually confronting power. And what Gandhi and Martin Luther King did with nonviolent resistance or civil disobedience was to actually disobey, right? To say the narrative won't change unless we actually disobey, unless we confront it, unless we march, unless we sit or protest. So it is a dilemma for me, because it feels as though narratives have power, and narratives require revolutions to upend them, right? And I mean, there are lots of people who do very good things as capitalists, and are, in many ways, huge contributors to society. But the dependency capitalism model is not going to get challenged unless people say, I'm not okay with this anymore. I am not okay that the bankers write the rules and that they don't go to jail and other people do, right? So, the answer to the question is, yeah, I think there are a lot of things. There are people I just adore. Albemarle School District in Virginia, Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia. I mean, I can name school or district after school or district. I don't know that that's enough. I think if my contention that this is as serious a social issue as any we've ever seen, it's not just the group of students who are in school, but it's the whole society that's been conditioned to follow and obey. If this is true, then it requires something larger than internal change. So that would be my sort of final note.
No. I hear you. And it's interesting to me that we're all coming at this from our own perspective and our own passion. And my choice had been to just check out, and my joy and my child's joy was so much more important than being an activist and fighting for change. I wanted to just get on with it. But I have so much respect for Anna and the teachers, everybody that's functioning within the system that has good intentions, that want only what's best for our children, that want to support learning, that really are in this for the right reasons. But what do you do when the system is set up absolutely not to support our children and not to support creativity? So that's something to ponder. Andrew, you had something that you wanted to add to this conversation before we go to break?
I think Anna did as well, but I'll speak first. Yeah, I've been coming up on that problem as well, Steve. That thinking that it seems such an uphill struggle all the time with everything, whether it be education or vaccines or mobile phone masks in our case, or everything, and feeling that yes, there does need to be some sort of revolution. But then, of course, with the word revolution, one comes across the sort of ideas that we have in our minds about what revolutions are, which tends to mean sort of armed struggles for me. So I don't know. It does start to seem like something bigger needs to happen than just us growing vegetables and keeping chickens and home-editing our kids. Yeah. Anna, you had something to say.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say that I'm not under the disillusionment that me being a teacher inside the education system is like, going to have some like an amazing ripple effect. Of course not. It's much more like I just happen to find myself in the system with this job because it is also a job, and so do with it what I can. Within my capacity, but in terms of a solution, I would say that it's really interesting that you bring up the word obey, Steve, in this context, or disobey, like in civil disobedience, because the word obeying actually comes from parenting. Who is it that has to obey? It is the child that has to obey the parent, and disobeying then becomes acknowledging the authority that the system has, saying that we are the little man, we are the submissive part in this power struggle, and thus we have no choice but to rebel against your authority. Where what I would say is that we can take the perspective of standing as the parent ourselves, standing as responsible for the system, and saying, that we are representatives of the system. This is our system. We have to take responsibility for it. It is people who are running it, and that the revolution in that sense is twofold. It is both internal. We personally have to deschool ourselves from everything that we've learned and unschool ourselves, as well as with our children, but also do it on a systemic and a structural level, which would indicate or mean like going into politics, going into the political system, but really with the aim of taking responsibility for it from within, being the parent where the system has failed.
All important points. Yeah, I agree, Anna. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back right after we watch this video to pick up this conversation. So thank you for the incredible conversation to this point, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
See you.
Every country on earth at the moment is reforming public education. There are two reasons for it. The first of them is economic. People are trying to work out, how do we educate our children to take their place in the economies of the 21st century? How do we do that, given that we can't anticipate what the economy will look like at the end of next week, as the recent turmoil is demonstrating? How do we do that? The second, though, is cultural. Every country on earth is trying to figure out, how do we educate our children so they have a sense of cultural identity, and so that we can pass on the cultural genes of our communities while being part of the process of globalization. How do we square that circle? The problem is they're trying to meet the future by doing what they did in the past. And on the way, they're alienating millions of kids who don't see any purpose in going to school. When we went to school, we were kept there with a story, which was if you worked hard and did well and got a college degree, you would have a job. Our kids don't believe that. And they're right not to, by the way. You're better having a degree than not, but it's not a guarantee anymore. And particularly not if the route to it marginalizes most of the things that you think are important about yourself. Some people say we have to raise standards as if this is a breakthrough. Like, really, yes, we should. Why would you lower them? I haven't come across an argument that persuades me of lowering them. But raising them, of course we should raise them. The problem is that the current system of education was designed and conceived and structured for a different age. It was conceived in the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment and in the economic circumstances of the Industrial Revolution. Before the middle of the 19th century, there were no systems of public education. Not really. I mean, you could get educated by Jesuits, if you had the money. But public education, paid for from taxation, compulsory to everybody and free at the point of delivery. That was a revolutionary idea. And many people objected to it. They said it's not possible for many street kids, working class children, to benefit from public education. They're incapable of learning to read and write, and why are we spending time on this? So there's also built into it a whole series of assumptions about social structure and capacity. It was driven by an economic imperative of the time, but running right through it was an intellectual model of the mind, which was essentially the Enlightenment view of intelligence. That real intelligence consists in the capacity for a certain type of deductive reasoning and a knowledge of the classics originally, what we come to think of as academic ability. And this is deep in the gene pool of public education, that there are really two types of people, academic and non-academic, smart people and non-smart people. And the consequence of that is that many brilliant people think they're not, because they've been judged against this particular view of the mind. So we have twin pillars, economic and intellectual. And my view is that this model has caused chaos in many people's lives. It's been great for some. There have been people who have benefited wonderfully from it. But most people have not. Instead, they suffer this. This is the modern epidemic, and it's as misplaced and it's as fictitious. This is the plague of ADHD. Now, this is a map of the incidence of ADHD in America, or prescriptions for ADHD. Don't mistake me here. I don't mean to say there is no such thing as attention deficit disorder. I'm not qualified to say if there is such a thing. I know that a great majority of psychologists and paediatricians think there is such a thing. But it's still a matter of debate. What I do know for a fact is it's not an epidemic. These kids are being medicated as routinely as we had our tonsils taken out. And on the same whimsical basis, and for the same reason, medical fashion. Our children are living in the most intensely stimulating period in the history of the earth. They're being besieged with information and calls for their attention from every platform, computers, from iPhones, from advertising holdings, from hundreds of television channels. And we're penalizing them now for getting distracted. From what? Boring stuff. At school, for the most part. It seems to me it's not a coincidence totally that the incidence of ADHD has risen in parallel with the growth of standardized testing. Now, these kids are being given Ritalin and Adderall and all manner of things, often quite dangerous drugs, to get them focused and calm them down. But according to this, attention deficit disorder increases as you travel east across the country. People start losing interest in Oklahoma. They can hardly think straight in Arkansas. And by the time they get to Washington, they've lost it completely. And there are separate reasons for that, I believe. It's a fictitious epidemic. If you think of it, the arts, and I don't say this exclusively of the arts, I think it's also true of science and of maths, but I say about the arts particularly because they are the victims of this mentality currently, particularly. The arts especially address the idea of aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is one in which your senses are operating at their peak, when you're present in the current moment, when you're resonating with the excitement of this thing that you're experiencing, when you are fully alive. An anesthetic is when you shut your senses off and deaden yourself to what's happening. And a lot of these drugs are that. We're getting our children through education by anesthetizing them. And I think we should be doing the exact opposite. We shouldn't be putting them asleep. We should be waking them up to what they have inside of themselves. But the model we have is this. I believe we have a system of education that is modeled on the interests of industrialism and in the image of it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Schools are still pretty much organized on factory lines, ringing bells, separate facilities, specialized into separate subjects. We still educate children by batches. We put them through the system by age group. Why do we do that? Why is there this assumption that the most important thing kids have in common is how old they are? It's like the most important thing about them is their date of manufacture. You know what I mean? Well, I know kids who are much better than other kids at the same age in different disciplines. or at different times of the day, or better in smaller groups than in large groups, or sometimes they want to be on their own. If you're interested in the model of learning, you don't start from this production line mentality. It's essentially about conformity, and increasingly it's about that as you look at the growth of standardized testing and standardized curricula. And it's about standardization. I believe we've got to go in the exact opposite direction. That's what I mean about changing the paradigm. There was a great study done recently of divergent thinking. Published a couple of years ago. Divergent thinking isn't the same thing as creativity. I define creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. Divergent thinking isn't a synonym, but it's an essential capacity for creativity. It's the ability to see lots of possible answers to a question, lots of possible ways of interpreting a question, to think what Edward de Bono would probably call laterally, to think not just in linear or convergent ways, to see multiple answers, not one. So, I mean, there are tests for this. I mean, one kind of COD example would be people might be asked to say, how many uses can you think of for a paperclip? One of those routine questions. Most people might come up with 10 or 15. People who are good at this might come up with 200. And they do that by saying, well, could the paperclip be 200 foot tall and be made out of foam rubber? Like, does it have to be a paperclip as we know it, Jim? Now, there are tests for this, and they gave them to 1,500 people. This is in a book called Breakpoint and Beyond. And on the protocol of the test, if you scored above a certain level, you'd be considered to be a genius at divergent thinking. Okay? So my question to you is, what percentage of the people tested, of the 1,500, scored at genius level for divergent thinking? Now, you need to know one more thing about them. These were kindergarten children. So what do you think? What percentage at genius level? 80. 80, okay. 98%. Now, the thing about this was it was a longitudinal study. So they retested the same children 5 years later, ages of 8 to 10. What do you think? 50? They retested them again 5 years later, ages 13 to 15. You can see a trend here, can't you? Now, this tells an interesting story, because you could have imagined it going the other way, couldn't you? You start off not being very good, but you get better as you get older. But this shows two things. One is we all have this capacity, and two, it mostly deteriorates. Now, a lot of things have happened to these kids as they've grown up. A lot. But one of the most important things that happened to them, I'm convinced, is that by now they've become educated. They've spent 10 years at school being told there's one answer, it's at the back. And don't look. And don't copy, because that's cheating. I mean, outside schools, that's called collaboration, but inside schools. Now, this isn't because teachers want it this way, it's just because it happens that way. It's because it's in the gene pool of education. We have to think differently about human capacity. We have to get over this old conception of academic, non-academic, abstract, theoretical, vocational, and see it for what it is, a myth. Secondly, we have to recognize that most great learning happens in groups, that collaboration is the stuff of growth. If we atomize people and separate them and judge them separately, we form a kind of disjunction between them and their natural learning environment. And thirdly, it's crucially about the culture of our institutions, the habits of the institution and the habitats that they occupy.
Wow, that is such a powerful video. I'm so glad we took a few minutes to watch that. Andrew, you said that you had some comments about this particular video.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I wanted to pick up on particularly. I think initially the idea of the peer group, the fact that the children, of course, are all the same age, completely antithetical to how everything else happens in life. Is there any other situation in life where we are just with people exactly the same age as us? It's utterly ridiculous. And I'm thinking about the schools we used to have in villages in England a long time ago, where there were very small schools, primary schools. So it was kids of all ages, and the older kids would help the teaching of the younger ones. And I also think about our twins and how good they are with younger children. They don't really have any problem with playing with very, very little kids, and also very, very happy and able to deal with adults. And I think it's that concept, that very, very narrow age group that the kids spend so much time in, that really disables them from a lot of the ability to deal with other people in life, really. And the other point was, I think Ken's idea that because children get so much stimulation now, that's why they find school boring. I don't think it's just that by any means. I think what's happened since the 50s is that the respect for authority has gone. People no longer think that an adult, particular teacher, is somebody who they must respect and must obey. Those two things combined, but I tend to think it's the fact that children no longer think that an adult is somebody who automatically commands respect and automatically is somebody who they should obey. I felt that the concept that children are stimulated and school is boring might well lead towards the idea that therefore kids all had to have iPads, and that was somehow one solution to this problem, because then they'd be stimulated at school as well, because they all have iPads. It doesn't seem to be a particularly useful idea, that, particularly in terms of the Wi-Fi incident, which we could talk about at the time. But yeah, I think he may well be wrong about that. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to me. I mean, I think, so many different things, but I think boredom should not be something that's avoided. I mean, from boredom, beautiful inventions happen and creativity blossoms. And, I wouldn't be afraid of presenting a child with their own time to fill, instead of keeping them busy. I think the idea of busy work all the time really is harmful to children. Yeah. And I think also, as homeschoolers, you and I both are unschooling family, the question that we get all the time is, well, how will your children ever be socialized? And that just cracks me up. You mean being out in the real world doesn't socialize our kids?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think they think that we keep them under very close control, and they don't actually meet anybody. Because, of course, school is after all, just a grand social club. That's really all it's for. If the kids don't go to the social club, they can't meet anybody. I wish it were just a social club, but unfortunately it isn't, is it?
Yeah, good points. I actually want to ask Anna what your thoughts are about the video, and if you had any response to what Andrew just shared.
Yeah, I well, to a certain degree, I can see what you mean about the respect for authority. But at the same time, what I'm seeing, like I shared in the beginning, what I see is that, and that also relates to what Ken Robinson is talking about in this video, in terms of how the creative or the expansive creativity of a child decreases with age. And that is quite in alignment with what I'm seeing, where, like I said, you have these 6-year-olds that come, most children, they look forward to going into the education system and, to learning. And then they come and they have all these questions, and they're just being, they actually learn that having questions and asking questions is wrong, and that, we don't have time and this is not relevant. And the older they get, the more passive they become, the more apathetic they become. And I think it was you sharing that as well, Andrew, that they become fearful of adults. And something that I've struggled with in my teaching, because I wanted to be authentic. I wanted to be real. I want to bring reality back into education. And something that I've struggled with, especially with the older kids, is that they, because I to them represents the school system, they see me as just another adult who wants to come and enforce something on them. And it's been very difficult to change that perspective. And to somehow show them that that's not what I want to do, because they're already so indoctrinated into it. Their spirit, if you want to call it that, is already so broken in a way from having had their curiosity and their passion, because a lot of kids, for example, these days, they're very passionate about computer games like Minecraft, and there are many adults that don't understand that and that think it's a waste of time, but it just happens to be their passion. There are so many, I would say like 80% of my students, their main passion is computer games or something with the computer in some form or another. And it's not like that passion. There are very few adults that take that passion and runs with it and say, show me Minecraft. Let's do a project on Minecraft. Let's find out what's this all about. And so they're being taught that what they're passionate about is not valuable, is not something that's useful to spend your time on. And so one thing that I did, for example, was, and this was all part of this project with like giving them authority, having them direct their own learning. So I did a project where they had to write down their goals, their educational goals and their personal goals. And there was one rule. And the one rule was that it could not be any goals that their parents or their teachers had set for them. It had to be their own goals. I was very clear about that. And I remember this one experience with a 7th grader. He's like 13 or 14. And he just sat there and looked at me and he said, but I don't have any goals. All my goals are set by my parents and my teachers. He had never considered before what he wanted to do in life. And then he kind of cautiously asked me for fun, but what if my goal is to play computer games? And then I said, sure, go for it. Why not? And he just looked at me with this look of shock, like an adult could say that. And what was so fascinating was that actually inspired him to think about it. And I told him that I know someone who's also passionate about computer games, and he went on to be a game developer. So I was like, if that's your passion, go for it. And then he actually realized, he was like, okay, but it's not that much of a passion. But he had never given even the thought before. And so, a lot of time it becomes an escape. They look for other places where they can feel like they have power over their own lives. And then computer games becomes like a form of opposition and rebelling against the parents, instead of them really being able to look at, is this really something that I want? What do I want to do with my life? So I find that their voice is being squashed right when it's about to develop and come out. It's being pulled down and it's being squashed, and it's tragic and it's heartbreaking, and it just makes me even more fired up to be that voice, not but in a humble way, not saying that I know everything about children, because of course I grew up in a different time as well, but to let them have the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think that's part of the design of the system?
Absolutely. That's the whole purpose of the system. Like John Taylor Gatto is saying, the purpose of the system is to dumb people down so that they more compliantly go into the consumer mechanisms of being satisfied with just working to survive, and then going home to entertain themselves with drugs or alcohol or music or movies or whatever. And then that becomes our simulation of what passion would look like, what living would look like, but where it's not even near what it would mean to really live, to really ask, what would I do if my life wasn't about being, I had to work to survive? Who am I? Even that question. Yeah, absolutely.
This is such an interesting conversation because I've given workshops where I try to help teachers understand that if you want a student to be able to follow their interests and be interested in something, they kind of have to see you model it. And so I said, so what do you care about? What are you passionate about? And how do you kind of manifest that to your students? And one woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I just don't have anything I'm interested in. I've been so busy for the last 40 years. I don't have any interests. And I thought, okay, that's really interesting, right? And at a deeper core level, it is a reflection of this dependency on the system, right? I mean, if you're Andrew and you're growing your own food, and you provide for most of, I'm not assuming Andrew's doing all of this, but let's say you're growing your own food, you're providing for most of your necessities on your own, then you can really think independently. But if every morning when you wake up, you are required to produce something that someone else will like in order just to feed yourself, then it's a really different situation, right? And it's one in which you don't end up actually thinking about what you're interested in and working on things that are valuable to you. I want to ask a question about Ken Robinson. I really love Ken. Of course, he's sort of an easy guy to adore. And but I have this theory, right, that a lot of progressive educators don't like how education is currently being done, but they like the idea that there is a system that they could plug their better ideas into. So they don't want to give up the system, because if it could be used for the things that they care about, then it's a powerful form of it's power. And so rather than question the power inherent in the system, they question the particular set of things that are being done at that point in time. So if we go back to this question of actual change, right, is Ken a palliative? Right? Does he make you feel good, but he doesn't actually ask that you challenge the deeper issues of the system? Or does he produce a change in thinking enough people that they're going to be more receptive to the overthrow of this kind of thinking?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I remember that this video by Ken Robinson is actually one of the things that sparked my interest in changing the education system. And I remember after watching it, I went and I researched him, and I was actually quite disappointed that he hadn't taken it further, that everything he was doing was within the system. So yeah, I would say that sure, it can spark something, but it's, it has to be taken from there. So I absolutely agree with you.
That's why for me, one of the particularly formative books for me was Summerhill, A.S. Neil. In fact, I went to interview his daughter, who now runs the school. Do you know about Summerhill, everybody? Yeah.
Yeah.
Summerhill, for those who don't know, Summerhill was a free school set up in the 20s, I think. Initially, he was taking very disturbed children who really didn't fit into school at all, and just letting them be there. There was no compulsion to attend classes at all. They could just be there, and if they wanted to sort of break windows or run around and break things, that was fine. He just let them. Eventually, they might think, well, maybe I could learn something, and the teachers were there teaching. What was this about? What was it? Where was my thread gone about Summerhill?
Well, Ken Robinson, you said you were you coming off the Ken Robinson thing and said that you read Summerhill and it really influenced you?
Yeah, in terms of something that I mean, you could say Summerhill's within the system because it's a school, but it's pretty much outside the system, really, in terms of a completely different way of doing it. Lessons aren't compulsory, and the absolutely key thing for me at Summerhill is that everything is controlled by a weekly meeting attended by all the children and all the staff, and all decisions are made there. And that is one of the key things that is missing in traditional schooling. The children feel out of control. They have no say over how the school is run. They have these pretend school councils that pretend to give the children a say on how the school is run, but of course they don't. The Summerhill model is fantastic, and it's fantastic the school is still there. It's a shame it's boarding school for me. It's also a shame it's 2 miles from a nuclear power station for me, but it's a wonderful model of how a school could be for me.
Yeah, Andrew, last week we actually had a representative from a Democratic school from the United States. It wasn't the Summerhill school, but we talked about the democratic system and how that's a really viable option. And I think if I was to ever put my child in school, it would be a democratic school of this nature. I looked at the Summerhill schools, which are amazing. But back to Steve's original question about Ken and the video, I think that it's an important message. I really, really do. And is he the person who's responsible for making change? I don't think so. I think his responsibility is to be the message bringer, the inspirer, the one that plants the seed of take a look at what we've got. Let's hold a mirror, a reflection to the system. And I think that's his responsibility, and I think he's doing it well. One of the conversations that we had during break, and I wanted to bring this up here to this panel, is the idea that I personally believe we're on the cusp of some sort of paradigm shift. And I think these truth bringers, like Ken and his message, and everybody on this fabulous network, and each one of you who has chosen to step outside of the system and change it from within in some capacity, I think we're on the morning of some sort of change in consciousness. And I don't think the way that school has been produced will continue to survive. And as Anna said during her introduction, she said that she's there to bring light to the system and watch it collapse, but by being, the truth bringer within the system. And so I think we're all doing that in our own way. But I wanted to ask the panel, what are your thoughts about changing, consciousness changing, consciousness shifting, and the paradigm moving into a new place in terms of education? Who'd like to take that?
So I'll give the counter argument first so we can have a fuller discussion. So
Okay.
I think historically there have been many really rich periods of time in which we felt as human beings that we had reached a new level of consciousness. We were creating intentional communities, or we were sort of wrapped around really exciting ideas. Certainly big political moments, and also sort of what might be called spiritual moments. And my concern is that by believing that this is unique, we underestimate the struggle for power that's taking place. So our daughter the schooling daughter, the one who loves traditional school, took AP World History last year, which means I took AP World History last year. And the story of civilization is a story of power and control. Who gets power and control? How do they maintain it? How is it challenged? And I think that's a really important frame for me. So if you look back at the early 1900s, you had this technology change, right? It was very easy to produce print magazines. And so you had this abundance of national magazines, and you had this opportunity for lots of writing. And you get The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and you get a lot of muckraking journalism that takes place. And then you get the progressive era that comes in and really sort of shuts that down and says, no, the elite make decisions, and we use propaganda to keep the herd in check, right? So then you get to the 1960s, and you have television, and it shows the Vietnam War, and you get, a lot of what you're saying probably people said in the 1960s, right? There was a lot of consciousness raising, and this is different. And the Trilateral Commission comes out with a report in the early 1970s saying we have a crisis in democracy. We have too much voice, too many people who think that they can impact the system, and our cultural institutions need to clamp down. I would suggest that this is a moment of opportunity, but we should not underestimate the degree to which those who have power and control will use this moment, use the technologies that we see as liberating to control and to reassert the authority that they have traditionally held, whether it's the banking or finance institutions or those who provide the machinery for war, that there are lots of risks to them in this consciousness raising that you're describing. And so I think, yes, it's a fascinating period of time to be alive, and I think there are brilliant opportunities. I'm not sure it's as unique as we think it is, and I think we do have to be careful to recognize that there are those for whom the current system serves them so well they're going to try and protect and defend it.
Yeah, so that's why it's so particularly dangerous that we get, for example, Facebook and Google putting themselves forward as some sort of voices of change or democracy. They look like part of the problem to me rather than part of the solution. Particularly Zuckerberg.
Yeah, well, Eric Schmidt's comments that Glenn Greenwald quotes in that beautiful TED talk about privacy it's just so revealing, and I hear them all the time from educators. There really is no privacy anymore. Well, wait a minute. Privacy is so central to intellectual freedom. It's so central to who we are as human beings. The need to protect privacy. That if someone like Eric Schmidt is saying, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't worry about everybody knowing what's going on. That's something we have. If we're not culturally pushing back on that, I'll tell you a quick story. So those in the room know that I'm a little bit of a domain junkie, right? So I look for domain names, and so I thought about last year. There was a call to have a digital bill of rights, right? So what's his name? The internet guy. You know what I'm talking about. And he called for an internet bill of network digital bill of rights. So I went online and I was able to reserve most of the domain names, like billofdigitalrights.com and billofrights.digital.com and magnacarta.digital. And I thought, well, this is really weird that no one has actually taken these names yet. And to me, it's a little bit troubling that we're not actually having these deeper conversations about what really should we be talking about. Librarians should be the bastions of protecting privacy. And yet a lot of the conversation now is around maker spaces. And these are fun and interesting things, but privacy is core to our Western culture in so many ways. That's a conversation I think I'm worried that we're not having. And Anna raised her hand.
Yeah, no, I was just going to go back to the point with the evolution or the paradigm change, and in terms of that being like problematic, what I would say is that nothing just happens by itself. You know, there's not a self-driven evolution going, meaning that it's beyond our direction. It is happening because people are directively doing it. Obviously, there can be like new developments in technology that can facilitate it. Like, for instance, with the internet having the ability that everyone can now research. You know, I can finally become an expert on my own body in learning how my body works, which I wouldn't have been able to for 200 years ago, or even maybe 50 years ago. Of course, there's a lot about cognitive disinformation as well, but I would say that the thing is that nothing is going to happen by itself. We have to make it happen. We have to actually make it work. And I would say that bringing it back to what you were saying about Ken Robinson, Lainey, is that, you know, each point of information in this regard is a part of piece of the puzzle. This video by Ken Robinson was really a piece of the puzzle for me. But I didn't stay there. You know, I took it and I ran with it. And so I see that the deschooling of ourselves as adults is one of the most important and fundamental processes in this change. Like, we have the opportunity now to move forward, but it's not enough to just create new systems or new communities, because what we see time and time again is that we revert back to our old ways because we didn't also in that change ourselves. So we think that just by changing a system or by changing an external structure, that will automatically also make us change. And I think that that's what we've been missing, so that these different perspectives, the structural changes, the political changes, the economic changes. For example, I'm part of something called the Equal Life Foundation, where we promote a basic income and a living income for everyone. And one of the key aspects of that proposal is to have parents become the primary facilitators and responsible adults for their children's education. I really see that as a very important part of the development, that parents are empowered to also step in, and by being a de-schooled parent, by having taken responsibility for your own educational process, you can stand as an example to your children. And I mean, obviously it might not be possible for everyone to homeschool or unschool their children, but then, you know, we could create these, like I was talking about before, these communities, educational communities. But that's something that I see is a very important part of the change. But we have to direct it and drive it to happen, which is what we're all doing. I mean, which is what we're doing with this broadcast. And we can't foresee or force it into a certain direction. So what I've said is that it happens like one person at a time, one point at a time. as well as on an internal and on a structural level.
Yeah. I wanted to say, Anna, do you still find Ken inspiring? No.
No, no, it was
That was a leading question.
It was an important part of like that initial, no, because I've gone much more radical,
Yeah.
you could say, since then. But I agree with you that he, or maybe it was Steve who said it, that there is this like, he's still within the system in a way, and you have to actually be able to walk through that cognitive dissonance in your own schooling that we've all been exposed to be able to see an entirely new system even being possible.
Yes, and that's why I don't find him inspiring at all. But I read Ron Miller again, and I find it inspiring. And I read John Holt and I read Illich, and I find them still inspiring. I think, gosh, this is why I think this. But Ken Robinson, I think, yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, well done, mate. But it's just down on Ken Robinson, this talk, really. Somebody else.
Yeah, but maybe we also don't have to expect like he's supposed to be now like some kind of revolutionary and take all of us in. He did, like you were saying, Lainey, he delivered his message. He had a message, he delivered it, and I mean millions of people were listening. So he did what he was supposed to do.
Yep.
Do you think he's very influential still, or is he very influential?
Can I put this in a frame?
Please, Steve.
Okay, so I think Ken is influential in the way in which cultures adopt ideas, right? And so I think part of what is important here is to recognize sort of what our human behavior is like and how we have cognitive limits. And so we depend sort of on cultural adoption of cultural ideas that then kind of pervade a system and become the next sort of platform for our thinking. And I think part of what we're describing is that there has to be some way of questioning and rethinking every generation, because we're sort of naturally attuned to adopt what's taking place around us. And if we don't go through a questioning process, then it kind of more and more deeply pervades, like I think we're feeling right now. We're at sort of a breaking point, this maybe fourth turning moment generationally, where we're so imbibed in this dependency capitalism that it requires some larger shift. So I think Ken is becoming increasingly pervasive in his influence, but the message is shallower across that influence, right? So there were the early people who listened, and it was deep and meaningful and significant. And then as it sort of spreads out, it gets thinner and shallower and becomes part of the cultural meme or the way in which people are thinking at the time. And so for me, I think somehow we have to be thinking not about what's the perfect system, right? What's the perfect kind of way of educating or the perfect way of thinking about human consciousness, but how do we create checks and balances or dynamics that allow each generation to rediscover and figure things out. And I think that was part of the brilliance, the flawed brilliance of the American experiment, right? Which was this understanding that it had to be renewed, democracy had to be renewed. And so you were protecting against the accumulation of influence and power, and you were protecting against the way in which human behavior can be selfish and mean and aggressive, and you were protecting against the buildup of armies and these things. So I think we have to sort of figure out how to talk about education or learning in that same way, where it becomes a generative process, where whether it's Summerhill or it's democratic schools, that each generation is recreating their own educational experience.
So let me ask you this, Steve. What would a transformed education experience look like?
Okay, so I don't think there's a single answer to that, right? In the same way that you would hope that each community through the process of democracy would build its own experience, that towns are going to have different ways of operating, that people are going to choose different foods, that we're going to have different cultural traditions that we adopt. And so I don't know that I would say there is a single vision for me, but if the anarchist freedom guy comes out, that I would want people to have the opportunity to build their own and to benefit from whatever wisdom the previous generation has to kind of pass down. But I wouldn't want to circumscribe someone else's experience. Like, I know one of my heroes is Carol Black, and her film Schooling the World has had a huge, profound influence on me, because I'm convinced that for us to try and describe what an educational experience would look like in rural India is just a disaster, has been a disaster. And so that might be a very different way of thinking about learning than if you're growing up in a city in the United States. I mean, that's probably not a fair way to respond to your question. Maybe there was something more there, but that's my first thought.
No, perfect. And in fact, I actually want to put that question to everybody on the panel. So Anna, to please share with us what a transformed education experience looks like to you.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve said on a personal level, like on an individual level. But if I'm to look at the possibility that education has, as opposed to what it's doing right now and the kind of world that we're creating through our education system right now, I'm looking at, instead of just having our life and our planet survive, to really get to a point of thriving, of expanding, of coexisting with nature, with animals. I mean, we're in the process of making so many animal species go extinct, and we're kind of just like instinctively using and consuming the planet as it is, as well as ourselves as a humanity. So I would say an educational process that, on the personal level, and this could be, wherever you are, whoever you are. Obviously, it's not something I can control, or but I would like, to have a greater emphasis on self-integrity, on the development of critical thinking, of each person being able to assess information critically for themselves, as well as having an integral integrity also on a physical level in relation to what will I do with my own body. Imagine, this is such a controversial point, but consider the fact that we don't even feel our own bodies. We don't feel the blood or our organs, or we don't even know how our bodies work. And it's the same with the planet on like a macro level. We don't even know the interconnectedness of life that we're a part of. And I would really like to see a life flourish and thrive from an intrinsic understanding of that interconnectedness, a humbleness, a respect. And I'm not saying this in a spiritual sense. I'm saying this in a very fundamental, you could say, socio-ecological sense of what is actually required for life to thrive, and not just exist, and not just use the resources and then produce more, but to actually create an existence where we could take it to the next level in terms of finding out what are we able to. I'm sure on a personal level that there's so much potential in me that I don't even have an idea exists. And it could be, and also with each other, collaboration and building and architecture and how to live. And we have the technology to do all of those things now. But of course, it has to happen in a sustainable and a common sense way, and not in this like romantic utopia where we think that with a blink of an eye, it's just going to magically manifest. Of course, that's not going to happen. But I would like to put out there that the potential for life to be so much more is there. And that's what I would like to bring into the educational process, because I think it's being overlooked, and that's destructive. Yeah.
Beautiful and so well said, Anna. Goodness. I want to actually bring that question to you, Andrew. If you could share with us what you feel a transformed educational experience looks like.
Yes, certainly. The main problem for me with school is that it reminds me of the joke about somebody from London coming down to a small village, an English country village, and asking a guy how to get to somewhere, and then the reply being, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And that's what my feeling about schools. It doesn't seem to me that we can start from how schools are in order to imagine a better system. But for me, certainly, that element of a compulsion has to go. The teacher/jailer concept has to go. I mean, one of my little flights of fancy about schools would be that the kids don't have to go there, but the teachers do. The teachers are in their rooms teaching, and they have to be there, and the kids can go in and out as they please. You soon find which subjects and which teachers are interesting because there'll be kids there. But even if there were no children in the classroom, the teacher would have to carry on teaching. That's my
That's an interesting suggestion. Something that I've imagined is like in my fantasy ideal society, that it would be, well, because I was talking before about a basic income, like if work was not tied to survival, right? If we could each work with whatever we're passionate about, and then the survival aspect is something that we all take care of together. And then I imagine that, that parenting will become a completely different, if it's something that you actually have to take responsibility for educating your children. You all three have experience with that. I think that there's a lot of people who probably wouldn't have children when it becomes something that is so fundamentally important. And so having children would be like a noble decision in a way. Like I would actually like to be the guardian of this new life coming into the world. And so that, could be an entire, you could say almost like passion or career in itself, being a parent and seeing this new life grow and develop. And then parents could come together and support each other. And let's say that I'm a mother and my child is 5 or 6, and now I would really like to go and do something creative, and support my community. Then maybe another mother just had a child, and then they could work together. So I'm envisioning something a lot more organic, and also where the learning is in the hands of a child. For example, with the use of educational technology.
Yeah.
So I think this presents us with another dilemma, right? Because we have scientific language and we have religious spiritual language, and we have a gap. We have this difficulty of bridging the two, right? And so I can describe to you scientifically how the brain functions chemically and electrically, and I can tell you about stimulus response, inherent worth and value of a soul or a child. I immediately get into religious language or spiritual language. And so we have this sort of gap that exists. What Anna just described, this place in which parents feel this stewardship and the necessity of being good parents, that actually describes a lot of really positive religious communities and societies. And if we accept at some level that we're built, however evolution worked, however the genetics work, that we're built to adopt cultural practices and the like through these kinds of traditions that we would call religion, right? That we don't have the cognitive capability to make conscious decisions about everything, and so we adopt a culture. So whether it's a particular culture or a religion, they kind of come with these pre-made ways of thinking about life and children and individuals. And it's really hard to imagine building that outside of the cultural traditions. So I think that's the dilemma, right? So we have this intellectual desire to create a system that would allow for this kind of honoring of the individual and parenting and choice and agency. At the same time, where you're going to hear those words most are in religious traditions. And we have this disconnect between our intellectual desires and between the religious communities. And I'm personally very interested in how you bridge that and have it be an and rather than an or, right? Where
I think that bridge could be the decision to live principled, to live based on principles that are in alignment with all life. Like we decide to live in a way that is best for all life, because that which is best for all life to thrive is best for me as an individual as well. So it doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be purely scientific. It's common sense. Like use common sense.
I agree with you. And I think the term religious actually opens up a whole new can of worms. We can talk holistic and spiritual and still mean the same thing. I think the word religious is a little charged. Anyway, there is so much, so many more places we can go with this conversation, but we are at the end of our time. And I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to give out their social media contacts and any information about projects that they're working on. So Anna, why don't you start?
Oh, so do you want me to name the links?
Sure, or any projects or anything.
Okay, sure. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I have a whole list. Well, anyway, first of all, you can find me on ateachersjourneytolife.com. That's where I write my blog on education. I also have an Instagram account where I focus on taking photos that reflect my insights on education. So whenever I see something, it could also just be society in general, I take a photo and I put it on Instagram, you know, to also try and use these social networks for something other than just like randomness. And then I'm part of, like I said before, an organization called the Equal Life Foundation, where we're working towards a basic income system. So it's a political organization, but also one of the points of emphasis that we have is self-education and this internal process that we've been talking about, the deschooling process. You can also find me on YouTube, youtube.com/Anna Briggs Thompson, as well as you're very welcome to look me up on Facebook if you want to connect with me and ask me any questions that you have. I also use Facebook in the same way that I use Instagram, probably like Andrew uses Twitter as well, to share what I see and encourage discussion and keep the discussion going, so that what I walk through and the process that I'm walking through it doesn't remain, you know, inside myself alone, but that others may take from it what they can learn and be supported by it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we'll list everything, all of your links on the show notes page on the Conscious Consumer Network page, and you'll find all that information linked. Steve, why don't you go ahead and give your social links and share a little bit about your projects as well?
Sure. Mine can be fast and easy. So stevehargadon.com is my main personal web presence. Learningrevolution.com is where I hold my conferences, and we do large-scale virtual events that are peer-to-peer conferences for teachers, librarians, museum people, school administrators, homeschoolers. Belief that all of these are part of learning professions and should be talking to each other. And then my newest project is www.reinventing.education. And it's a workshop that we're doing this month in Asheville, North Carolina, that we hope to take on the road to help communities talk about education and learning.
Great. And Andrew, would you like to share your links?
Yeah. At the moment, I'm mainly active on Twitter. That's Andrew_J_Green. Also, my blog website is andrewgreen.tk. That's TK. Yes, TK. My main project is I'm in the middle of starting a book about holistic green thinking, which is for me going way, way beyond the environmentalism and into attachment parenting, home education, self-sufficiency, all that sort of thing, because I think there's a lot of people involved in all these things who aren't joining the dots. I see a lot of people, particularly in the alternative health movement, who aren't thinking anything about educational parenting. And of course, I see that in all of those things, actually. I'm trying to encourage people to join the dots, really, and to put all those small changes together to make a bigger change.
That's very great, Andrew. Glad to hear it.
Thank you.
I'm really thrilled to hear it too. I would love, this is the second show, and I would love for this panel to come back again in the future. You guys are all so incredibly inspiring, and there's so many more conversations that we can have about this. So thank you everybody for joining us here. And wherever you are in the world, whatever you're doing, continue to do it just for the love of learning.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.